Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you have your coffee or your tea or whatever wakes you up in the morning. We are early here at MythVision and we are live. Welcome to MythVision Podcast. I have Dr. Meredith J.C. Warren joining us. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. I was looking on YouTube and I was like, I can't find her. I need to find her. Well, guess what? I'm lucky. I get to have you on as a kind of a first appearance to YouTube world and presenting some of the insights that you've had. Let us get our little intro started, and then we're going to have a hangout, kind of go all over the place. I think it'll be fun to just go with the flow, and then we'll take questions from our audience and have a little fun.
Sure.
Awesome. We are MythVision. I'm excited to talk to Dr. Warren. How are you today?
Yeah, I'm doing well. It's the afternoon here, so we got a nice sunny day, and I'm pretty pleased with how things are going.
Yeah, I hope they're doing well. I was excited to have you this morning. I woke up extra early. I am so busy, it's ridiculous. And I got the book just a tad bit late in terms of being able to read exhaustively. Before we get to that, I just want to mention your website, right? So meredithwarren.hcummings.org. You can go, you can follow up everything from her CVs on here, her publications, videos, and interviews. Hopefully we show up on this as well. I just got to update the website, of course. It's probably not difficult to do. But tell us about your website. What do you have here that people can go and check out?
Yeah, so this is a Humanities Commons website. So Humanities Commons is a place where academics can host their works open access in an open access format. So I'm using this to sort of just showcase my CV. It's kind of like an extended CV. And if you go into if the publications, you can click through, you can get links to my books. And if anything's open access available free of charge, it'll be on there. So I try and publish as much as I can open access. And I'm the editor of an open access academic journal, so it's something that's really important to me. But yeah, you can have an explore any public scholarship that I've done writing for The Independent or for other newspapers. Washington Post is in there, some videos and interviews. And of course, I'll update it as soon as I can, the link to this.
Wow, that's pretty cool. What did Jesus look like? There's all sorts of, that's the one I saw.
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't see this one. The Taste and Transform. This is on YouTube.
Yes, it is. But that's hosted through the university, so it might not have come up with me.
That's why I had trouble finding you. I watched this one last night and I thought, I could taste the cheese right now. Because if you watch it, you'll see why I said that. But yeah, you can go check out our website. It is down in the description. I really hope people will go and check out her work. She did another podcast as well, talking about some of the stuff we may be discussing today with Jewish and Christian women in the ancient Mediterranean, which I don't think we're going to go exhaustively today. We're just going to touch this because it's a textbook, a one-stop shop to really give you quite a bit of insight on this. In fact, people are using this as textbooks in academic courses when they're trying to learn about women in the ancient Mediterranean world, whether Christian or Jewish. And of course, you have your publications. I just want to plug those, letting everybody know Jewish and Christian women in the ancient Mediterranean, which is what we titled this. But we were thinking we might go off into other things. She published on different things as well. That's her latest one. So you're wanting to go get a copy of this for sure. And what is this about? Just so that we can tease the audience a bit.
So, I mean, there wasn't a textbook designed for a lay audience or an undergraduate audience that touched on or introduced women's roles in early Judaism and early Christianity. And so, my co-authors, Sarah Parks and Sheena Scheinfeld, and we've gone through and given an introduction to sort of the history of early Judaism, the texts you need to be familiar with, the texts that you need to be familiar with in early Christianity, and also non-Jewish, non-Christian ritual and religion in antiquity, so Roman religion, Greek religion. And all of that provides a context for understanding the kinds of rules, activities, texts, characters of women in antiquity. So we look at literary characters like Judith and Susanna and Mary Magdalene, but we also look at like likely historical characters like Prisca and Phoebe, and the other women that that Paul mentions in Romans 16, for example, and just how women are used literarily, what kinds of authority roles women had in antiquity, sort of everything that you need, a one-stop shop, as you say.
I love that. Especially, I love that you also go beyond just the Christian Jewish dichotomy, because you actually point out in the book that there's not really a dichotomy often. In fact, there's an overlap where you're like, is this Jewish or is this Christian, or is Christian at this point still Jewish? So like there's that issue with like not Francesca, but Paula Fredrickson, and like how Paul is actually Jewish and we like to paint him as Christian, and we kind of don't get that change takes place over time. So, but also the fact that you get into Roman religion and how much impact did that have on the Jewish world? When I read, what's her name? I always butcher this. It's Jews and the Roman Rivals by Cattell Berthelot. She had a book she recently wrote, and it's about when Rome was pagan, how much impact did pagan Rome have on Jewish thought? And like, we always think about Christian Rome and its impact on Jews, but like before Christianity, like how much impact? And there was definitely impact. So it makes you wonder, like, with your approach to this, what do we see in common between the Roman religious women and Jewish and Christian women? And like, is there some commonality there? I definitely am interested in checking that out further. Once we read this, MythVision, I think we can do a deeper dive. I have not read it because the publication did not come in time for me to really dive deep. What is this work, though? This one really catches my attention.
So that's my first book, and this is about this really odd passage in the Gospel of John where Jesus says, "Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you won't enter the kingdom of heaven," or something. And the sort of crowd is just horrified by this idea that you have to commit cannibalism in order to be saved. And so people have been talking about this sort of few verses for millennia, right? Trying to figure out what it means. And so this is my offering to that debate. And in that book, I argue that we need to, again, sort of step back from this sort of narrow tunnel vision of only looking at the Gospels or only looking at the New Testament, or indeed only looking at, directly related texts, and look to the wider worldview. What other texts do we have where people die and come back to life? What other texts do we have where people are sort of ritually sacrificed, and that sort of contributes to how we understand their ontology? Are they divine? Are they human? And so I look at a collection of texts that are called the ancient romance novels. They're romance novels from the first few centuries of the Common Era. And the protagonists in these romance novels, they're women, and they get mistaken for gods all the time. Everywhere they go, people worship them, and it's kind of ambiguous in the novels whether that's appropriate or whether that's inappropriate. Are they actually manifestations of the goddesses that they look so much like, or are people making a mistake? They're also nearly sacrificed in this sort of send up of a religious sacrifice. So they're offered as human sacrifices. And in antiquity, an ordinary sacrifice, a meat sacrifice, would have entailed a barbecue. So it would be the default to say, okay, we're going to sacrifice this animal and then we're going to eat it afterwards at the barbecue. And so that's implied in a lot of cases in these novels. So I look at the way that characters in Greek and Hellenistic literature are are pointed as divine. And this connects with ideas of heroism. So lots of scholars have already pointed out the connections between Jesus's characterization in the Gospels and the hero. Joanne Brandt, for example, has written on that in the Gospel of John specifically. And just those connections between, okay, if we've got sacrifice and we've got sort of fake cannibalism, and we've got this misidentification, or is it misidentification with the divinity, how does that help us understand what's going on in John 6? So my argument is it actually helps us see that this is a Christological statement. It's a statement about Jesus being divine, and it's not to do actually with the Eucharist, which a lot of people think John 6 is about the Eucharist. So that's the sort of main argument there.
There's a lot there, and I'm
It's a lot.
interested in hearing what you have to say, because I guess I'll start with that, and then we can jump into the women in the ancient world. As far as that was a concern, a lot of people, I've even had rabbis on, right, that are Orthodox rabbis, and they're like, this is so anti-Jewish. Now, that might be anachronistic. I don't know, because it's difficult to parse out exactly what was practiced by Jews, Hellenistic Jews in the first century. But this idea that they would eat the flesh, or that a Jew would say, like, eat my flesh, drink my blood. That sounds more
Yeah,
like
I mean, you're
Greek.
not supposed to drink blood in Judaism. Like, that's one of the things you're not supposed to do. But no one was eating human flesh anyway.
Right.
Like, no one was doing that. Greeks weren't doing that. Romans weren't doing that. Like, no one's doing that. What is happening is accusations of cannibalism are really common. So there's an anthropologist called William Ahrens, and he wrote a book called The Man-Eating Myth. And in it, he wrote about how actually cannibalism isn't a reality so much as it is a narrative, a cultural narrative. So we would never eat people, but those guys over there, they would eat people. You should stay away from them. They're dangerous. And so it's a way of creating a boundary marker between an in-group and an out-group. And there have been other sort of, other people have written on this as well, but there's an idea that in Christianity, a lot of the accusations that get quote unquote thrown at Christians are actually sort of inverted, and the early Christian community kind of owns them and says, like, okay, well, here, yeah, we are going to do that. So what of it? And so it's a really interesting way of thinking about cannibalism as a boundary marker that then gets turned into this sort of wider metaphorical way of understanding belonging.
There's so much to unpack in this. Definitely, I think I will want to read that book before we dive into it. But as far as your women in the ancient world, so far in my reading of that book, because I have not finished it, it seems that you and other colleagues were obviously teaching courses and realizing, oh gosh, let's write that down. Oh gosh, we need to put this down. Like, there's nothing like this out there. And you finally said, here's a one-stop shop for all of this content, scholarly material. You put it into a publication. You had a few grants that made this possible, actually, in the process. And now this is actually being used in if you will, colleges around the world to teach on this topic.
Yeah, I mean, it just came out in January, so I think it was first used this past academic semester for the first time. But yeah, it started out with my two colleagues, my co-authors, Sarah Parks and Shana Scheinfeld. We taught this class together on early Jewish Christian women, and we had to do everything from scratch. There were source books, so texts that sort of collated and collected all of these inscriptions and all these textual references to women's activities. But it was really inaccessible for an introductory class. Undergrads were just not able to sift through that material and make sense of it themselves without some context. And so we taught that class twice, and then we all moved on to other jobs elsewhere, other countries, other continents. And we came back and just realized that there was a real need for this book, because it's a class that's taught in college campuses across North America. It's taught in the UK where I live, and there wasn't anything affordable or accessible. And so we naively started out on this project without realizing that it would actually take several years. But we made it, we did it, and now we have something that I hope people will be able to really get into the material with, and learn a little bit more, and then take that knowledge and go and look at those source books, look at other materials that we sort of point to as further reading, and dig in deeper.
I guess the obvious question is, what was it like for women in the ancient Mediterranean world, whether Jewish, Christian, Roman, in their religious practices? Can you tell us, can you tease us and give us kind of an overview, airplane view? We're all looking down out of the airplane to kind of see the world. And you're telling us what did their role, what was their role, what was the activities that they did, what was their importance in these religious communities, and maybe you have to say what each one, they might have had different roles depending on the community or whatever. Can you take us into this, even though I know this is like the Enigma code itself? It's like,
Yeah.
Yeah, anyway.
I mean, I think the short answer, or the big picture answer, is it was incredibly diverse. And it was incredibly diverse, not sort of in these pockets of, okay, Roman women were like this, and Jewish women were like this, and Christian women were like this. But there's a huge range of roles and activities that Roman, Jewish, and Christian women all share. So it might be more similar, a Roman woman in Egypt, a Jewish woman in Egypt, and a Christian woman in Egypt might have some more similar roles to each other than they would have to a woman of their own religious group, if we can even talk about that at this point in time, in say northern Italy or something like that. Right. So we have this incredible diversity. And one of the things that we like to point out is that there's more similarities among these groups and among these women, within Roman, Jewish, and Christian religious traditions than there are differences. And I think we tend to try and make those differentiations, which aren't actually there when you go and look at the evidence. And it's really useful then to be able to use evidence from Roman women's ritual practice to shed light on Jewish women's ritual practice or Christian women's ritual practice, for which we have less evidence. And then the other thing that I think is an important big picture consideration is that we have a lot of texts written by men who are trying to tell women that they shouldn't do things. Some people like to take those texts and say, this means that women didn't do those things because this man told them not to. The other way you can take it, which is how we take it, is that you wouldn't set a rule if no one was doing the thing. Right? And
I
so
love
we
it.
take that as evidence that, women were baptizing because Tertullian says, stop baptizing. Right? So we know we have evidence sort of between the lines that women were doing a lot more than these sort of patriarchal texts would allow them to do.
It's like
So it's fun. You get to dig in.
yeah. It makes me think of the phrase, like some of the later pastorals that are trying to kind of act like Paul or whatnot. And they're like,
Yeah,
you want to be saved? Birth children. Like
exactly.
there's literally baby making machine context of like, if you want to be saved, you need to just have babies for us. Okay.
Yeah.
Which sounds like either this is going against what is the name of the sect that wants to like stop having children, stop marrying,
The Gnostics?
it's
Docetists?
a term for those. I guess
Ascetics.
Gnostics would practice that, but I think it's like a
I mean, there's
general
tons.
term specifically in that vein. But yeah, they're like trying to stop population. I know Marcionites were also trying to do the same thing. Like
Yeah.
it's this tendency to not want to birth and have kids and repopulate because
Right. Well,
they
it's going to
kind
be
of
the end of the world, right? It's going to be
right.
the end of the world. Why would you have a baby? The world's going to end. Jesus is coming back.
So that what you're saying, like, don't do this, that really fits into what we call Judeo-Christian context. How does that work in the Roman world? Do we still see this patriarchal like aggression towards like, don't do this, women, you need to not do that? Was it also a same kind of
Yeah.
misogynistic kind of world in a way?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, what's really interesting is that exactly the same time that early Judaism was sort of was becoming its own thing, sort of coming out of Hellenistic Judaism, going into Roman period, in the post-Temple period, and then as Christianity was just starting to develop, what we have is the Emperor Augustus passes these laws that are all about controlling women and controlling the family. And he he expresses them as like, this is the way Rome used to be. And it's almost like a like make Rome great again kind of thing, right? Where we go back to these family values, and if only women would behave themselves, then everyone would be okay and Rome would be glorious. Okay. And so that is happening. That's the context for, the statements about women in early Christianity, the statements about women in early Judaism. It's Christianity and Judaism trying to be palatable to mainstream Roman society. It's not that that they were any more or less conservative than the Roman world. So you have Roman women doing all sorts of things, and we have lovely inscriptions, especially of working class women being out in the world, doing their thing, sacrificing, doing lots of sort of freelance ritual practice, freelance ritual experts, things like that. And we have to imagine that Jewish and Christian women were doing exactly the same thing, because we have these texts that tell them not to do that.
There's so much to unpack. You said earlier there's a lot more in common than there are differences as women's roles were in the ancient world, especially when it comes to the religious practices and such. I'm no expert at all, but as I've dived into like critical scholarship and stuff, there's a lot of apologetics, if I can use the term out there, to try and like make everyone only focuses on the differences, because they don't want there to be, they want, to put it point blank for Christian apologists, they want Christianity to be wholly unique, completely separate, totally you can't identify anything else that's similar to it. It is God's gift to earth. There's nothing like it, et cetera, et cetera. But more I study the academic world and stuff, of course there's differences. I'm not saying there aren't. I get it. But I'm finding a lot more common ground that makes me go, this didn't like appear in a vacuum. This wasn't a protected Judaism bubble either that had no influence from Hellenism and the Greco-Roman world. Do you see that in the practices of women in the ancient world as well? Like there's a lot of overlap.
Yeah. I mean, anything that you can imagine, like Christian and Jewish women doing, is going to have that kind of sort of fluid influence. I think the idea that there's like such a thing as like pure Judaism or pure Christianity is like, it's just barking up the wrong tree. Like you're never gonna find that, because there isn't such a thing as that, right? Like everything exists within its historical and social context. So women leaders, right? Women leaders in the early church and in early Judaism. It's such a hot topic, because there are some denominations where women still can't be ordained, right? Or are discouraged from taking leadership positions over men. We have tons of examples from the Roman world of female priestesses, right? Like this is a norm in Roman religion. You have a priestess. It's not anything to be surprised about, right? And we know from evidence, like Bernadette Bruton wrote a book in the 80s about this, right? Jewish female leaders in the ancient synagogue. We also have tons of evidence, even into late antiquity, of women being leaders in the early church as well, right? And so there's tons of examples of this. I call them three religious traditions. It's kind of anachronistic, because they're not really religious traditions. Religion didn't exist at this time as a concept. But anyway, we're on YouTube, so I'm going to say it. But they have the same kind of authority. They have the same kind of roles. They're overseeing whatever is important in their communities. They are benefactors. They're patrons. They have money. They host communities in their homes. And they do the kinds of good deeds that their traditions expect them to do as a benefactor and as a practitioner.
Are there, I was thinking about this. There's so many cases, men, patriarchal systems, whatnot. We always have to have a say. And like they want to suppress, especially later church fathers are really bad about this, it seems. But are there any examples in the ancient world where, so let's use an analogy, the book of Acts or Acts of the Apostles. I think it's highly fictional. That's not my point. My point is you see this like wrestling between this Simon Magus and Paul, or Peter. Peter and him are not getting along, and he's trying to buy the Holy Spirit, of course. It's a jab at Simon. And there's like this wrestling between two men in this community. Do we see literature of women that are like, oh, no, you didn't? And like, you know what I'm saying? And they're like going at each other and they're demonizing the other one. Do we have any literature that survives? Because I'd imagine men probably didn't care to copy that throughout the ages, but maybe there's something we found or inscriptions or something that was like, and this, I don't like her because she did this and that. I don't know, like competition.
I can't think of any. I'm sure that some exists. I just
Right.
can't think of any off the top of my head. The only thing that I can think of right now, I mean, part of the problem is, as you say, is most of the stuff that we have that survived as literature is authored by men. There's very little literary texts that survive that are authored by women, and so we wouldn't necessarily, even if there was something like that, we wouldn't necessarily have it because it just either didn't get preserved or didn't get written down, right? But I'm thinking of like the juxtaposition of the bride and Babylon in Revelation, for example, as like a pitting of women against each other. And those are both symbolic women, like those are not real historical women, but there is this sort of use of like thinking with women, right? Of pitting the ideal good bride who's the heavenly Jerusalem against this evil, monstrous female figure who is Babylon or Rome. So there's that kind of like antagonism as well. And Revelation likes to use women to think with. He doesn't actually include um, possibly any actual women in his book at all. Um, but I mean, that kind of thing exists for sure.
I was just thinking about that because if we use our contemporary example of life, like my beautiful Mrs. MythVision, the like how much she has to say, how much goes on between her and then there's other girls in the world and whatnot. And you got to imagine how much we don't have that was going on. And that's what I'm wondering if there was any
Absolutely.
like, there's this lady over here and she had a problem with this other lady. And like, here's this issue going on in the ancient world. It also gets into gender, right? This is another interesting thing. I had Jennifer Bird come on recently and she said I can't remember who wrote the article or who wrote on this, published on it, but like mentioning eunuchs was a weird thing because they weren't they weren't categorized like man or woman. They were in an
Yeah.
other category, it seemed.
Yeah, we like to think that the gender binary is some sort of natural, like innate biological thing that exists, but a binary gender was not how gender was imagined in antiquity. Men, it was one gender. There was men, and then there was everyone else. And people who we would call men today were not categorized as men in antiquity necessarily, right?
Hmm.
It was a sliding scale. So an enslaved man is not actually going to be the Latin weir, right? It's not going to be classified as a man. The emperor is the weir, right? But it's men and everyone else. And so we have a very different idea of gender and how you perform it and how social class and proximity to status and things like that intersect with it. So yeah, it's a lot more complicated. We try and touch on that in our books, in our book as well. And the idea of a eunuch is sort of someone who exists um, outside of the binary that we imagine as natural, but fits into that structure and that hierarchy in antiquity.
There's so much there to unpack that, and that's why I really do want to get deeper into this work, and we can even cover particular texts or particular issues because you're going to source it and then it's going to rabbit trail me into some other thing I'm reading and then I'm lost in a whole nother category of discussion. So I really am enjoying this. We got a couple super chats, so periodically someone will super chat. I always give them a shout out. They come up colorful on the screen. You've probably not had to engage with these since doing YouTube, but people can super chat their questions and ask whatever they'd like to ask, and we have fun with the audience. So Scott Duke, thank you for the super chat. What motivated Dr. Warren to suffer and toil to get a doctorate in theology?
I appreciate the recognition of the suffering and toiling. Um, yeah, I'm a super nerd, and I did an undergraduate degree in anthropology and scripture and interpretation, and then I did a master's in New Testament, and then I did a PhD in early Judaism and New Testament because I just couldn't get enough. This is, I couldn't read enough. I couldn't explore it enough, and I was just so interested in this. I've always been interested in classics. I did Latin in high school. I got really interested in biblical languages, so I did Hebrew and Greek in university. And it just seemed like there was such a wealth of material to uncover and explore, and these questions that I could see people raising about the New Testament, which I think is such an important cultural text, even if you're not a Christian, that have such an impact on the world. And I just thought, you know what, I have something different to say about these, and I'm really fortunate that I have a job that allows me to do just that, and to spend a portion of my time, researching anything I want, which is super fun.
Yeah, I feel like I'm in the same boat. I mean, we might have different motivations that might get us interested into a topic, and reasons for it. But yeah, I'm in the same boat. Like, I'm transparent. I tell people I don't buy the ontology of Christianity or anything like that anymore. But I am fascinated with understanding the reality on the ground, the historical context that explains the rise of some of these ideas, ideologies, traditions, whatever you want to call them. And it just sends me down this path where people are like, you need to do your PhD, but I'm having fun. I don't know if that'll be fun. It might be, but it might be difficult. And my point is I get to interview you and then 1,000 others, and I get to listen to everyone else as they bring their PhDs to the table. And I could just kind of like have fun doing that and learn, rather than having to be a specialist in one of these things that I may or may not really be like halfway through it. I might be like, did I really want to be a specialist in that? Because I really have an interest in this as well, or that, or, I don't know.
I mean, yeah, you have to. That's the thing, is you do have to specialize, and eventually they do kind of make you write a giant piece of work that you kind of decide a topic, and then halfway through you're like, oh, actually, I might be interested in this other thing. I mean, that's kind of what happened to me, right? Like, I wrote this first book on the Gospel of John and eating flesh and blood, but then halfway through I was like, oh, actually, I want to write something else on different types of food and different types of eating, and that's where my second book came from. Was you know sort of a passion project as I was writing my PhD, which is the Food and Transformation in Ancient Mediterranean Literature book that we were talking about before
Yeah.
we hit record.
Oh, I did
Yeah,
not bring that up yet, actually. Let me show that for our audience who has not seen it, real quick here. I don't know why I forgot to. We were on a roll. I think that's probably why. Food and Transformation in the
that's it.
Ancient. Yeah. And this book is specifically, can you give us a tease?
Yeah, so this is basically the best way to explain it is there's a trope in literature where if you eat something from another realm, it gives you special access to that other realm, whether that's heaven or hell. And the best analogy I always use is Alice in Wonderland. So Alice tumbles down the rabbit hole, she ends up in this liminal space, and she can't access Wonderland. She's not the right size to get through the little doors. And so something appears, right? This drink me bottle and these eat me cakes, and she ingests them, and she's then able to access Wonderland. And the same kind of thing is happening in these ancient texts. Okay, so I look at Revelation with the ingestion of the little scroll. I look at an ancient Jewish apocalyptic text called Fourth Ezra, where he ingests this fiery liquid. I look at an early Christian text called The Martyrdom of Perpetua and Felicitas, a pseudepigraphon called Joseph and Asenath, where Asenath consumes this honeycomb and she gets sort of her name written in the book of the living in heaven. And also the Persephone myth, which some of your watchers may be familiar with, where Persephone is kidnapped by Hades and taken down to the underworld. And because she's eaten pomegranates from the underworld, she's bound to stay in that place. I mean, other examples are like the pill in the Matrix, for example, or if anyone's seen Spirited Away, the animated film Spirited Away, there's an example in there as well. So it's everywhere once you start looking for it, but no one had really come up with a way of talking about that and the effects that it has specifically in sort of early Christian and early Jewish literature. And again, they were looking at these texts in isolation, so looking at the Jewish texts or looking at the Christian texts, but not putting them in conversation together. So that's what this book is about.
Ooh, there's so many questions I have about that. Even I must say, this pomegranate that you have in your this is starting to make me think. I've been exploring your website for a minute now, and I'm thinking to myself, why does she have a pomegranate here? Because I've been told, I'm gonna come back on the screen here. I've been told, for example, there's some Jewish rabbis who thought that the fruit in the garden may have been the pomegranate. And I've also been told there's kind of a little lore behind the pomegranate itself, that there are 613 seeds inside, which represent each law of the Torah, and like what is supposed to be obeyed by the Jewish people that God chose. And here's this special fruit with this amount of commandments inside of this fruit. But you know, when I always thought otherworldly, when I listened to your presentation about the cheese, the Eucharist, and you were talking about Persephone just briefly and stuff, it piqued my interest. Just teased me enough to go, I need to know more. But I always thought, when I approach stuff like these visions and these things they're describing, like, what kind of drugs, right, did they do? That's what I thought. But you're exploring it, and it's not just like psychedelic or psychotropic types. It's a pomegranate could fit the category of an otherworldly fruit. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, in the text, I mean, my research, I like to stay in the narrative realm. And so whatever is real in the narrative realm is real enough, right? Because when we read, we sort of suspend our expectations of reality, and we live in the narrative world, whatever the world is that the author creates for us. And in these texts, the world creates a pomegranate that is transformative, or the world creates cheese that is transformative, or the world creates a scroll that is transformative. And in ingesting this, I mean, some of these take place in visionary contexts, so apocalyptic contexts, where sort of God provides a vision or some sort of revelatory experience, but not in all the cases. It works just as well in an ordinary narrative context as well. So yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to notice how we have neglected the sense of taste and this and the experience of eating in providing revelatory divine knowledge and divine experience, and that's really the main point of my work here.
Couple interesting things that come to mind with this eating thing. Reading Francesca Stavrakopoulou's amazing book, God and Anatomy, and I know you probably talked to her about it all the time or whatever. She mentions that, and we're going to talk about this on the show, so I'm teasing our audience who's here. If you're here, you're lucky. You get to hear some of the interesting things we'll probably bring up. That Noah, this situation happens, this catastrophe. Like, God is pissed. He kills all humans on earth except this one guy and his family, Noah. Then Noah sacrifices this animal, and God smells the food. And what is the deal with food to the gods, right? So if it's important to the gods, your whole point about it being important food-wise, wouldn't it be important to the humans? And so, especially if the Bible's narrative is that we're reflective images of this divine. So whatever that might mean, in her case, it means anthropomorphic-wise, that we are actually in the shape and form of actual gods, just smaller. It makes me think of that. Like, this food, this clean animal that is sacrificed by Noah is so important. And I don't know if you've ever been starving before. I'm sure we've all tasted this. And then you smelt that dinner plate and you went, oh, you are everything. Thank you. Like, everything. Well, that's the picture I get when, like, God smells the sin of the sacrifice. Then all of a sudden he's like, dang it, I shouldn't have killed all these humans that
he was just hangry.
He was hangry. And then he's like, whoa. So the experience, I will never do that again. And then he makes his covenant with his euphemistic rainbow, as she describes as his power. Yeah. It's amazing how she goes into this. But the question I had is A.P. Ruck. I don't know if you know Carl A.P. Ruck. He wrote on, he's a PhD at Harvard. I don't know why he's not retired yet. He must love this stuff. But he talks about, he thinks that there's more of a psychotropic ingestion of drug-laced type substances in these, whether it be the Eleusinian mysteries or Eucharist. He thinks might actually be that, because he thinks that they watered down the wine, and he was thinking you'd have to drink 5-6 cups of this to get plastered and to have these experiences. Do you think that that's not necessary to take that approach?
It's absolutely not necessary. Anthropologically, there's tons of communities that have mystical experiences without taking any psychotropic drugs at all. So we know that that's not necessary.
Right.
We also know there's communities that do take psychotropic drugs and have these kinds of experiences, but that doesn't mean that people in the ancient Near East or the ancient Mediterranean did that. What's the most telling for me? I mean, that kind of argument has been around for a while in different forms, and I do touch on it in the Food and Transformation in Ancient Literature book. So there's like a big chunky footnote on it. What's most telling for me, there's a couple of things. First of all, psychedelic mushrooms don't grow in that part of the world. So that's that one out. The wine thing, like, I'm just gonna tell you, like, I've been drunk in my life. I've been super drunk in my life. I have never had an experience like that,
Me
right?
neither.
Like, I've had the spins, but God has not like appeared and given me like a mystical piece of cheese before. Pizza, I would have accepted. But you know, like this, how strong does this wine have to be? And there's people who've done this research and have calculated like the maximum strength of wine. I mean, even like port is strong wine, right? And it's not going to get you like high. But the most telling thing for me is that the texts themselves don't talk about it that way, right? The texts are not shy about people drinking wine. They're not shy about people offering incense. They're not shy about talking about the different kinds of rituals that people do in order to facilitate interaction with the divine. What you do see is the opposite. Actually, often you see people fasting, okay, not ingesting things. So maybe you can say, okay, well, if you're really, really hungry and you haven't eaten, maybe you'll have a vision, maybe you will. But you know, that's not a guarantee either, right? Something else is happening here beyond what you do or do not put in your mouth in a physical space. And that's where I think the literary tropes and the cultural tropes are so important. It's because we are governed, our experiences are governed by the narratives that we tell ourselves and that are important to our communities. And I think recognizing how food and taste can be transformative can help us think about how actual communities might experience that kind of ingestion or eating. So, like, I haven't written about this yet, but I keep thinking about it, and I have a student who's writing on it right now. But thinking about how, for example, the Eucharist might be experienced transformatively. Does that relocate a community that's taking part in the Eucharist to an eschatological, a heavenly realm because they've ingested this sort of um, atemporal, this outside of time body of Christ, right? Is this a way that can help us think about what's going on in community practices? It's not something that I've like thought through very much right now. But this is the kind of thing that I'm hoping to put forward is, you know, we've got a cultural narrative. It's really pervasive. It's in our text. They're telling us to pay attention to it. We haven't been paying attention to it. What else are we missing?
There's a lot there. Yeah. Yeah. I'd love to see what you bring up with that, because I always read this stuff and you kind of want to think either they're crazy, like the Apostle Paul, or they are, you know, prone to this. There's something up, right? So they're prone to these hallucinations, or another possibility, and these are just occasional letters and we're just not sure, is he's having dreams. So maybe he's depicting his visions that he's having in dreams. I mean, we have dreams all the time. So there's all sorts of other explanations. Some people think he took drugs, right? So like, I don't know if it's necessary. I don't think that might be even ad hoc to put that in there, as you're pointing out. So another super chat, Doc Pluromana is in the house. Thank you, Doc, for that big super chat. How did early Christians reconcile Deborah's leadership with the apostolic injunction that women not teach or hold authority? Referring to her Hebrew name, B, for submissiveness seems an attempt to highlight her domestic role.
I mean, I'm
If
not
you don't
sure
know something, by the way, don't.
how bees are submissive. I'm also not, I mean, I'm not sure specifically about Deborah's leadership in early Christianity, but it it it's pretty clear to me that this was not an issue for the women who were leaders. So the apostolic injunction not to teach or not to preach seems to have been largely ignored by a whole bunch of women. Um, and I don't think we have a ton of them named Deborah or anything. So I'm not sure that they saw that particular leadership role as one that they were emulating necessarily. That's off the top of my head.
What maybe are some roles that you're aware of that women in leadership roles or whatever, who were some of their heroes that we know they looked up to in Hebrew, in the Hebrew world? Like, for example, if they're Jewish or Christian, did they have any Bible, Old Testament or Hebrew Bible examples they really liked to bring up, or do we not really have much of their writings at all to even know?
We don't really have much writing. What we're mostly going off is inscriptions and funerary monuments. So we have, inscriptions that say like this tombstone was erected for, Prisca, who was a priestess in her community or was a deacon in her community, and her husband and son loved her very much. That's kind of the stuff that we're going on. And so we don't have a lot of narrative discussion. What we do have, I mean, we have some early Christian texts that talk about Mary Magdalene as apostle to the apostles, right? And of having access to special knowledge that Jesus gave her specifically, which makes some of the male disciples quite upset about that. So we have examples of that kind of thing. We have the example of the woman whom the seer in Revelation calls Jezebel, who is a leader maybe in Asia Minor, who is leading one of his communities astray as he would see it, but she probably wouldn't see it as leading astray. She probably
Is
would just
this
like, get away from this guy.
that Revelation 2 where it's like led them
I will,
to eat meat sacrificed to idols and then commit a fornication or something like that?
yeah, yeah.
In light of the Mary Magdalene, there's a question I'd have to, it's demanding I ask just to get your thoughts on this. Doc, thanks for that super chat real quick. I just wanted to bring this up. Is like, in a patriarchal society where mostly men dominated and whatnot, what are the odds someone would create or fictionalize that actually being the case? So for example, like Mary Magdalene is the apostle to the apostles, right? Like in a world dominated by men, what are the odds you would make that up? This is unless it was women who created it, right? So
Yeah.
what do you think about that approach?
So I mean, that's from the Gospel of John, right?
Mhm.
This idea that Mary Magdalene is the one at the tomb who actually sees the risen Christ and goes back to tell everyone what's happened. And so, that notion of being an apostle, being one sent to spread the good news, that's where that idea comes from. And one of the really interesting things that's common across all four of the Gospels, and these are some of the criteria that people use to evaluate historical authenticity, if you want to call it that, is if you have multiple attestations across sources that don't use each other. Now, there's huge debate about whether John had any of the other gospels and whether the other gospels had each other and blah blah blah. And embarrassment. Does this look awkward for people who are trying to establish a patriarchal church? So those are two things that are kind of interesting to think about with this. So Mary Magdalene is at the tomb in all four of the gospels. There's other assorted women in the synoptic gospels. And the question is, does it look a little bit awkward for example, Peter, that he's not the one that's this apostle, that's this one who witnesses the risen Christ like that. So on the one hand, you could say, okay, that's really strong evidence. Mary Magdalene, that must have happened, okay, and she must have been the one to share this good news first. One of the ways that women get used in literature is to shame men. So women are used to say, even this silly lady got it before you did, right?
That's
So
horrible.
surely even you can get on board now, Peter, and other people who want to be like Peter. So, on as a feminist, I would love it to be like, yes, Mary Magdalene, she was there, she did the thing, she's a hero. But with my critical scholar hat on, I have to raise the suspicion that like she's a literary character. We have to read that in the context of how women are used in other texts from this time period, and it doesn't necessarily say that she was really there and really did that thing. It might be to say, here's an example of someone who is lesser status than our target audience, and we would like to embarrass our target audience into believing this.
I love that answer, by the way, because I that was the problem I had with my good friend Del Allison Jr.'s approach in the resurrection in his latest work. He goes into 1 Corinthians 15 with Paul, and he lists all these witnesses, and no woman brings up. There's not a single woman in the list, and his response I thought was weak, in my opinion. And me and him talked about this. He goes, well, you could think that. He thinks there's more kernel of history here in the gospel than I do. And I said, look, you're saying that Paul didn't list them because it's a patriarchal, he used the term androcentric
Mhm.
church. Then why in the world would the gospels do this.
Paul's not shy about listing women elsewhere.
Right. And the Gospels aren't afraid either. I mean, look, if you look at like John 4, right? It's a woman's testimony, a Samaritan at that the whole city's listening to. So
I have a lot to say about that text.
I'd love to. I can't wait to do more episodes with you, by the way. I can't wait. Yeah. What did you, I mean, what do you, I want to hear what you have to say. I'm done talking. I want to hear you.
I mean, the Samaritan, so I just published an article on this actually in October, I guess, called Slut Shaming the Samaritan Woman. And that's open access. It's on my website. So you can go and click on that if you want. It's free to access. But basically, I mean, that's another example of women being used to think with. And she is being, again, used. It should be under publication and CV. I think you're in, publication CV. Yeah, down there somewhere. Is it in there? 5 Husbands, that's the one. But basically, I mean, this is an example of a text that's trying to make Jesus look good. It's trying to make him look like he is being nice to women, and that's how certainly lots of feminist scholars have read it, as this is a text where Jesus is nice to this woman and includes her, and she's a Samaritan, and he had no reason to talk to her. And really what this does is sort of denigrate this woman as this is even this woman who's had so many husbands. Either she's very unlikely, she's a murderer, or she's just someone who likes to have a lot of husbands, to say that euphemistically. And I'm just sort of trying to draw our attention to the ways that also scholarship is doing this. The text doesn't do it as much as scholarship does, and our reading of this text kind of draws out that misogyny.
This really makes me want to like reread the material, kind of approaching it this way, because I've never really thought about it that way. Like, why are they, imagine this is a guy writing this. What is their goal in this? Now, what do you do with the woman who's anointing Jesus' feet? Because I'll give you a fun, interesting perspective, and then you can tell me if you've ever heard of it or if you think there's something maybe here. And the thing is, things can be eclectic, so it could be multiple things, like layered in a way. The woman goes to anoint, it's Mary, if I'm not mistaken, who's going depends, but let's go with the early Mark, right? Okay. Is it in Mark? Is it Mark that she did? I think it's Mary. I could be wrong.
It's in all 4 of the Gospels. In John, it's Mary of Bethany. In Luke, it's a sinner. And I think it's Mary in Mark and Matthew.
Well, she's anointing Jesus' feet for his burial, for his death. She knows he's going to die. But, if we use that approach, that I think they're right on the money in Mark, is that this is the secret gospel, where it's like Jesus' identity, nobody knows his actual identity. And Dennis MacDonald, I don't know if you've ever read his work. I love the guy. I mean, I really think he's underrated. I don't think enough people are giving him some credit. You may not draw all the mimetic connections and things like that as he does, but he says, look at Homer and look at Euryclea. She's washing Odysseus's feet, and she recognizes her master.
Yeah.
I think there's something to it.
So Casper Bro Larson has written about this in a book on recognition scenes in the Gospel of John, because that's a literary trope, the recognition scene where the hero is disguised, and then there's some sign that you can recognize the hero by. So I mean, I'm totally convinced by that. I want to correct myself though. It's not Mary Magdalene in any of the texts. It's an unnamed woman in 3 of the 4 texts, and it's only Mary Bethany, not Mary Magdalene in the Gospel of John.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, so pretty much the recognition, I just thought this made a lot of sense on them knowing the story of Odysseus. And
absolutely, I don't see how you could not see that. If you're sort of percolated in this Hellenized world where, like, if you know Greek, you've been copying out the Odyssey and the Iliad for your whole life. Like, how are you not going to know? How are you not going to see that scene in that? So yeah, I'm totally on board.
So it's a literary thing. Is there anything there kind of saying, once again, like you said with Mary at the tomb, like, come on, if she gets it, okay,
absolutely,
you need to wake the hell up.
Absolutely, yeah, because it shames everyone else, right? Their reaction, whatever the reactions are of all the disciples, it's the wrong one, right? Every man in that story who reacts to that doesn't get it, right? Whether those are the fellow diners in Luke or Judas or whoever it happens to be, they get it wrong, right? We are supposed to identify with that woman. And I don't think it's because the text is like, women are fabulous and they know the truth. I think it's because the text is like, you guys are a bunch of dummies. And here's how dumb you are.
I want to chuckle, but I also want to be like, this sucks. The way that we used to view women and the way things were treating women, that's what sucks. But I gotta say, I'm glad that the way that it's been approached now, it's giving her some credit. Like even the way we're interpreting it now, I know that like I get it, but like when we approach it, it's like, dude, you guys didn't get it, but she did. All right, so we kind of turned it on its head in a way. It's kind of backfired, in a sense, the way that things have been interpreted by it.
I mean, I think it's also, I mean, I'm a biblical scholar, I'm interested in antiquity, but I'm also interested in how communities use texts. And I think that's a really important thing to think about as well, is like, you are not bound to use a text in the way that the author originally meant, whatever that happens to be, if we could ever know that, right? Like texts are living, they have a relationship with the communities that use them and that value them. So there's not one way of interpreting the text. There's not one reading that's there.
Okay, one more question. And then what I want to do, by the way, I love everything you've said. And I really appreciate your time. I want to do this again. I want to go into my flesh and my, drink, the whole cannibalism thing. I want to get into the slut shaming article. I want to get into all of it. I want to get into how food transformed, what's going on there. You have a lot of stuff because I actually found you, once again, for those tuning in now, in a book called Coming Back to Life, because I was interested in understanding that porous boundary between the dead and the living, and how funerals happen, what they thought of the dead. The dead, when they died, weren't just not there anymore. Like they still, even today, people will be like, grandma came and talked to me last night or something. You're like, hold on, what? But she's dead. Like, so it's hard to let go when you're so used to people existing. Anyway, I started to look into that because I was wanting to look at how resurrection evolved, not only in the Judeo-Christian worldview, but the Greco-Roman one, and hero cults and all that kind of stuff. So I came across your work and I was like, email, and found you, and you gave me the time. So my final question on this particular one, this is kind of a weird, odd one probably, is that being the bride of Christ, here are all these guys, right? Mainly guys that we hear about writing this literature, talking about becoming a bride of Christ. Like if it's in this patriarchal system and misogyny is running rampant, was it shameful for them to be viewed as a bride of Christ? And like, or what, how do we understand the bride of Christ in light of this whole issue?
I mean, I think this kind of connects back to the discussion we were having earlier about gender just being a fundamentally different construct in antiquity than it is today. There's tons of metaphors, and you've got Francesca's book there, where God is imagined in feminine or female terms, right? And so it's not it's not as inflexible, I think, as we would imagine. It would imagine it to be. We like to imagine antiquity as like more conservative or more like rigid than we are today. We like to imagine ourselves as sort of enlightened and more flexible, but that's not. It's just different, right? It's a different way of imagining things. So, I mean, there's a lot kind of going on there with the whole bride. One of the things, I mean, sort of connecting back to funerary motifs is you get unmarried girls being imagined on their funerary monuments as the bride of Hades, for example. So they didn't get a chance to marry, so they'll marry the god of the underworld, kind of like Persephone or something like that. So, I mean, you can kind of imagine this kind of relationship, and those are women. They're not. I don't think we have any examples. There's a book coming out on this, if it's not already out, that I got the chance to review. But I don't think there are any examples, at least not in the book that I read, on of men being imagined as a bride in this way. But Christians like to do fun things with gender, and sort of using feminine imagery to talk about, to sort of transform the sort of the virile idea of what it is to be a man in antiquity. So people have written, for example, about the sort of masculinity, the inverted masculinity of Jesus being sort of penetrated with the spear. and the sort of blood and water coming out that's like the amniotic fluid and the menstrual blood and things like that. So there's all sorts of ways that early Christians are kind of imagining an inversion of ordinary gender norms where masculinity is power and femininity is weakness. So it might be something to do with that. Yeah.
That's interesting, because if they're being martyrs, they're weak. Their strength is being weak in a sense. So if they're playing the role of a non-powerful, what we would look in the world and say is powerful, they would be in the role of feminine. And it might also play a role, I don't know, is the fact that where Paul's talking about not to marry, right? Like he's kind of like, let's not keep having kids. The end is nigh. Like maybe that also plays a role in some way. This apocalypticism of
Absolutely.
you don't need to marry because you're going to marry Christ. You're going to be bound to him forever or whatever. I don't know. It makes me think. So
Yeah. I mean, I don't think you can understand what's going on with Christianity's ideas about gender without thinking about apocalypse in some way, because they're just inseparable. All the social elements that sort of Paul talks about, and fake Paul, as I like to call him, talks about, you can't really separate it from this idea that there's a sneaking suspicion that most early Christians have that it's not going to be forever. Whatever this is, it's not forever. Some people might have thought it was next week, but a couple of years from now, or any minute now, a millennium from now, and all of what is going on the earth is a way of biding your time in the best way possible until that time comes. So, however gender is constructed, it is in the service of that apocalyptic moment, I think.
much. Thank you so much. Sorry, I was muted. I do have one more super chat here. If anyone wants to ask a quick question, super chat your question. If not, we will be having her back. I just didn't want to go too long our first episode, so you can get a taste of what it's like to go live and hang out. Gnostic Informant, my buddy Neil, if you haven't subscribed, you've been hiding under a rock. Please go subscribe. Do you think the Vestal Virgins had anything in common to the Christian nuns?
That's a really interesting question. And we talk about the Vestal Virgins in the Jewish and Christian Women textbook. Um, so, yes, there's something in common. Both groups are women who are set aside and don't marry and don't have children, and they're sort of sequestered. And there's also kind of this ambiguous categorization of both sets of women where the Vestal Virgins are dressed as virgins and also Roman matrons. So there's specific forms of dress for unmarried and married women in ancient Rome, and they kind of embody both of those. And just so, as we were talking about, sort of married to Christ, Christian nuns are sort of unmarried, but also imagined as sort of married to Christ in some way. So there's lots of commonalities, but I think the trajectory between Vestal Virgin and nun is like not actually a direct line at all. It's more I mean, it's very different. The Vestal Virgins, you actually got released from your duties once you turned a certain age in sort of your early 30s. So you'd be consecrated from a young child, and then you would be returned to your family, and you could marry and have children then, and have an ordinary life. If you could still have children at that age, no reason why not. So it's a very different context. I think the Christian nuns thing, we've got a model in sort of the development of asceticism in later antiquity, which is related to this. It's sort of a movement within this sort of apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic notion of the world isn't ending yet. I've got to get away from this world, right? This world is dangerous and it's going to suck me down with it. I've got to get somewhere else. And so we do have women who are wanting to retain power outside of marriage, who see that as an attractive option. It was an option to just stay single in the Roman world. You didn't have to be, if you were a widow, if you were unmarried, like if you had your own money, you could certainly just stay a single wealthy woman forever. So that's not like the only option that you had is to become a nun, but it was an attractive option to study and to go and live somewhere in community with women. So there's commonalities, but I don't think there's like a direct line.
I this brought up the idea. I don't know why we didn't get into sexuality that much, but the idea of women with women, right? Why is Paul even mentioning this in Romans 1? Well, it's going on, and I'd love someday to even bring up that idea, like what was going on in the ancient world. Was it normal in the Greco-Roman world for these activities? Maybe a quick response. I got one more.
I mean, I think absolutely it was normal. We've got in our textbook again. I'm pitching the textbook here. There's a lovely funerary monument of two freed women who are holding hands in the way that a married couple hold hands in their funerary portraits. And we can read that as an example of this loving relationship between these two women, whether that was a sexual relationship or not. Like, we don't really have any evidence, but we can see loving same-sex relationships, whatever form they take in antiquity. Bernadette Bruden has written a book on this called Love Between Women, and it's really excellent if you can get your hands on it. That has tons and tons of evidence on that topic.
Amazing. This is really, really fun. All right, final one. Stop Scamming Man. Thank you for the super chat. What people won't know from reading the Bible is that there was a Judean queen regnant, Salome Alexandra.
Yep, there's actually several queens in early Judaism, ancient Judaism. We have a whole section on them in our textbook. They have all sorts of court intrigues. Josephus writes about them. They're often painted with sort of a negative brush because they probably to diminish their power. They work closely with different leadership groups in early Judaism. They have popular followings. So yes, absolutely, there's tons of female rulers in Jewish antiquity.
Thank you so much for that super chat. Stop Scamming Man and Neil from Gnostic Informant. And Carl is right. Attain true gnosis when you subscribe to Gnostic Informant. I really appreciate your time. Everybody go check out our website. And I mean, there's our publications. You can read a lot of free publication, or you've made your publications like articles and such that are public right here, Publications and CV. You can get her works. I highly recommend you go do that. Is there anything else that we didn't mention that you'd like to plug about anything really?
Well, I mean, I'd like to say keep your eyes out for a book that I'm co-editing and co-authoring with some colleagues of mine on combating Judeophobia or anti-Semitism in the New Testament. So that's coming out with Eerdmans next year. So just keep your eyes peeled for that.
That's been a question that has been on my list for a while now. Is how do we know it's anti-Jewish? And because we're dealing with this porous boundary of like, well, what we mean by Christian really at that time was Jewish in some sense. But is this cessationism at this point where Christianity has taken the identity of Israel, where non-Jews are now counted as true Abraham's descendants, and they've capitalized on that, and now they're condemning those who are remaining this Jew? And like, is that what's going on in the New Testament? Some people want to go, no. When it talks about Jews, it's only talking about leadership. It's only attacking leadership. Now, that might be the case in early Gospels like Mark or whatever, but by the time you get to John, when it's like just broad stroking, what's going on here?
John is a great example of that. Adele Reinhardt's wrote a book called Cast Out of the Covenant, where she argues that John is not at this point, not a Jewish text, where I would see most of the synoptic Gospels and Paul are written by Jews, Revelation's written by a Jew. So yeah, it's a really complicated question, right? When do you get to the idea of supersessionism? And so that's one side of the thing. The other side of the question, I guess, is like, regardless of whether we consider these texts supersessionist in their intent, they're certainly being used in a supersessionist and anti-Semitic and Judeophobic way in their effect, right? And how communities have used them. So I think that's a really important thing to point out too, is right, we got this intent, but we also have how they're used and what their effect is now. So we really have to be mindful of that. And that's kind of what we're doing with the book as well.
Few fun comments about John. Jennifer Bird brought up, she said, there's a book I needed to get. The Man Whom Jesus Loved was actually, if this is a Greek text written by a Greek or someone who's Roman, Greek, whatever, and it's not Jewish in the sense that you would think, then this would fit the category of a man loving another man, or a man loving a boy who's a follower, a disciple of his, and that it could be this homoerotic type of relationship in John. Also, the interesting thing is like these categories that Jesus is fulfilling, he is the true vine. This sounds Dionysian, and it makes you kind of go, what the freak is going on?
Yeah.
I love it. It's fun.
Yeah. There's lots in there. People have talked about the Dionysian connections as well. And I mean, if you want to get into, Jesus having a paramour, we've got the secret Gospel of Mark to get into, and all sorts of things. So yeah.
Oh, let me ask you that. And I'm sorry, I'm asking, do you think that's authentic? Or do you think it's the secret
I'm
gospel?
agnostic. I went to a panel at SBL on that topic years and years ago, and it was the only time where I thought the panelists were going to actually punch each other in the face.
I love it. Yeah, so you're not sure. You're really not.
I just like the idea of it, and I like that it's a mystery. I like that we have this thing that we just don't know and no one can agree. I just love that. I'm here with popcorn.
I love it too. Oh, Dr. Meredith J.C. Warren has finally come on MythVision, and we now know who she is, and we absolutely must show support for our guest. And how do we do that? We go and get a copy of her books. We go and read her publications. We share her information out there all over the social media world. Let's get the insights out there. Let's teach what scholarship has to say on the subject, because they're reading source material. They know the languages. They're actually looking at it and comparing it and debating it and peer reviewing it and all this fun stuff. So help support her. Go to her website, get a couple books, let the publisher know, okay, hold up. When they go to MythVision, we need to send more information, more of this knowledge, get this out there in the public. And the way that we pay back is simply get a copy of the work. It's that simple. And so I really appreciate your time. Is there anything else we didn't touch?
I mean, we didn't touch a whole bunch of stuff, but I hope you'll have me back sometime.
Yeah, I hope so too. And for those who are watching this live and watching this later, help us out here at MythVision. Become a Patreon member. I could use the help every month. There's people who drop off, and this is a full-time gig. I do this. You don't have to pay, but if you're able to support and become a Patreon member, I do give privilege to those who join, early access to stuff. I've got lots of videos. You can also have some type of control in the sense of steering me towards academics I've never heard of that you know of and you'd love to see me interview. So you get to play a role in history, because I really think that we're making history here, publicly putting information that you'd have to pay thousands of dollars to go to a university to really hear, or you'd have to somehow know about this literature, read their works, but it's not really popular, not in the same sense that I'm trying to make it. So help us out. Thank you so much for this time, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Thanks so much for having me, for all your questions as well.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and everybody else who fits any other category. We are MythVision.